want to thank you again for all the encouragement you gave me to do this book. It's one of the most meaningful things I've done in my career. And
it was amazing. All 684 pages of it. There was so much. I thought I knew a lot about Jim Thorpe, but your book was so enlightening.
Well, thank you. Well, it seems that, almost every Native American I've interviewed has some connection to the Carlisle Indian School, which was so integral to this story and to Jim Thorpe's life. Can you tell us about your family's connections to that school?
I had great uncles and aunts who went to Carlisle. And, those stories didn't really come down to me directly because my grandfather and my great-grandfather did not go there. They went to boarding schools in Wisconsin. Uh-huh. But Carlisle was that was the school upon which all the other boarding schools in America were patterned after, So I got a sense of Carlisle through the stories that my grandfather told of Tomah, because Tomah was patterned after Carlisle.
And probably even worse in some ways. Tomah.
Yeah, it was interesting. People forget about the industrial part of the American Indian Industrial Boarding School.
Yes.
Children worked. I mean, they went to school half days. And the other half of their day was spent working as farmhands or scrubbing floors, washing dishes, tatting lace, depending on their gender, of course. So it was it was a life that was intended to create a generation of second-class citizens, because these children were going to be taught just enough for them to be suitable, blue-collar servants or farmhands.
Yesterday I talked to Suzanne Sean Harjo, and she said that they were trained to be good prisoners or soldiers.
Oh, exactly.
In a sense.
Well, that's the other thing. If you look at World War I, the number of Native American boys who enlisted in the military and became part of the American Expeditionary Forces, it was a seamless transition from the boarding schools to the training camps to the front lines.
Yes.
Because they were marching to dormitories, they were marching to their classrooms, they were, marching to their jobs after school, and every aspect of their life was regimented.
That's one of the many, many paradoxes of that situation, that they were trained to be like the U.S. cavalry that had killed their grandparents, basically.
And what I really appreciated in your book was, the fact that you nuanced what it meant for those American Indian boys to be playing the sons and grandsons of Army generals who had, terrorized their communities. And now, that's the amazing thing about sports, which I think you did a really good job in explaining, is that was really the only place where these boys had any kind of freedom. Mm-hmm. And here they were being allowed to compete and sometimes thrash pretty brilliantly the sons of the generals that had, in some cases annihilated their people.
Yeah. Now, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but going back to your family in Carlisle, wasn't there a woman, Denomi, who was a relative of yours, who also had a connection to the nursing school there when Thorpe was there?
Yeah, I didn't know much about her. It's interesting. The urban Denomies pronounce it that way. The reservation Denomies,
yes.
above Highway 8, north of Highway 8 in Wisconsin, is kind of the dividing line. Denomie or Denomi. And are you talking about Alice or Josephine?
I don't know which one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she wound up in an administrative position at Carlisle, and I had other relatives who wound up going to boarding schools and then joining the Indian Service, which was the organization that really shaped Indian lives on reservations through boarding schools across the country.
And I should have pointed out earlier that you come from the Bad River part of the Ojibwe Nation. Can you tell me about that sort of culture and heritage?
Yeah, I was hoping that you would give the old college try to pronouncing the actual name, the name that we have, which is Mashkiiziibii.
Okay.
And then I was going to have a good chuckle because nobody gets that right.
Mashkiiziibii?
Mashkiiziibii, which translates to Medicine River.
Okay.
And that's what we call our community because the Bad River, which is a name French gave this beautiful Medicine River, which provided so much of our food and medicines, and still does, actually. It's a really abundant wild rice producing area. So we are located on the south shore of Lake Superior, and our lives traditionally revolved around fishing, gathering wild rice, monoman as we call it, planting corn, gathering berries, and taking deer. Those are our 5 traditional foods. Our seasonal cycle was pretty much organized around food. In the winter, you speared fish through the ice. In the spring, you speared fish when the ice had cleared. In the summer, you gathered plants and tended a garden. In the fall, you gathered wild rice, and in the winter, you trapped. So we were never adversaries of the federal government, but there was an effort to remove us. Zachary Taylor wanted to relocate us, much the way the Sauk and Fox were removed during Black Hawk's era. And by the way, I have to tell you, I absolutely loved the connection that you made between Black Hawk and Jim Thorpe.
Oh, thank you.
Especially as it related to the parades. You know, Black Hawk was paraded through East Coast cities as this prisoner of war and this symbol of the vanquished Indian.
Yes.
And then, you know, generations later, there's his descendant, Jim Thorpe, being paraded and celebrated through those same cities. I thought that was brilliant. Really thought that was brilliant, David. So back to Bad River.
So Zachary Taylor tried to move you across the Mississippi?
Right. He wanted to put us right in the heart of Sioux country, and the Ojibwe and the Sioux were, traditional enemies. And we were able to resist and just refuse to move. It's a long story. The government moved our treaty annuities to Minnesota, tried to get us to move there. It was a debacle. Many people died, and it just furthered our resolve not to be moved. And then the next president, Millard Fillmore, rescinded the removal order, and we were able to establish our reservations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan as a result.
And how many of people are there now of
my tribe?
Nation? Yes.
Well, there are different bands and different tribes of Ojibwe, both in the United States and Canada. There's somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 Ojibwe people. And then we have kissing cousins among the Ojibwe Cree people, and some other people that may not be Ojibwe.
Well, that shows how the vanishing race did not vanish, because at one point there weren't even that many total Indians counted in the whole country.
No,
it was down to 250,000 or something.
Yeah, and that that to me is nothing short of miraculous, David. When you think about the efforts that the United States government took to assimilate, annihilate, remove, trying to get us to vanish, and the fact that here we are many, many centuries later, and we're still here. We have some problems. I mean, we're losing our language, our languages. That's a huge thing. There's so much anxiety in Indian country over the loss of language. And that's a direct result of the boarding schools.
Yes.
Kill
What
the
can be
Indian
done
and
about
save the
that?
man.
Is there anything being done about that, trying to preserve those languages?
Yeah, actually, and I think it's really interesting. Google, I think, has a big initiative now to provide translations, as they do for, the Romance languages and Chinese and Arabic. Now, I think they're going to add Navajo, and there's some other languages as well. But I think most tribes are taking really serious steps to revitalize their languages. If you just Google a tribe and language, you'll find that there are language classes online. There are language camps being held in the summer. There's this sort of desperation, knowing that a lot of our ceremonies, our identity is embedded in the language. That's where, culture resides in the language. So it's really important for us to try to reclaim that. There are immersion schools popping up across the country where children are learning their native language, and in the 6th period for foreign language, they're learning English.
So the opposite of the boarding school process, right, in a way.
And what's really interesting, I'm thinking about Wadoka Nodding, which is an immersion school in the Lakota Reservation in northwestern Wisconsin. The teachers use traditional activities like the sugar bush, preparing maple syrup in the spring, which involves a lot of math and science with boiling points and that sort of thing. They're incorporating math and science into cultural activities, incorporating art and history into cultural the cultural activities and practices that tribes do routinely. They're using those as experiential learning.
That reminds me of Braiding Sweetgrass, the Robin Wall Kimmerer book. That's she's a botanist who went back to some of those old ways.
That's one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book. I buy about 10 copies a year and give them away to all the people that I love or want to impress, or want to save.
Yes.
To get a copy of Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And I teach that. I use that in my classroom. I teach Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's always, at the end of the year when you get those student evaluations, that's always, one of the highlights of the year for my students is reading that book. It's really transformative.
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, Patty, I know that among your many interests and talents is sort of a love of sports. And the history of sports. And of course, there's a strong history of athletes from Wisconsin going out to Carlisle. And I know you studied some of those. Can you tell us about that sort of connection?
Yeah. And, for someone that wrote extensively about the Green Bay Packers, you probably know that the first professional football player was an Oneida Indian who went to Carlisle and was a big deal there, came back, and every little town had a football team, and I can't remember whether it was Bessemer or Marquette or one of the teams in the Upper Peninsula was trying to lure him to their team, and the Acme Packers, I think they were called,
yes, they were.
The local Green Bay team. The team from the UP had offered him a free apartment, I think, and I think the Packers offered him $20 and maybe an apartment too, or maybe he was close enough to live at home. I can't remember, but anyway, he was the first documented paid athlete, and I always thought that was kind of a funny story. I think. There were lots of Metoxins who went to Carlisle that came back Joe Guyan was a pretty famous.
Yeah, he was a great player.
Yeah, a really good player.
And tell me about St.
Charles
Germain.
Albert Bender, who had relatives at Bad River. I think White Earth claims him, but he was an Ojibwe, and the first, I think, well, he might not have been the first American Indian inducted into the Hall of Fame, or maybe he was the first pitcher. But he invented the slider, and I mean, I have a riddle for you, a puzzle.
Okay.
Charles Albert Bender, who was called Chief Bender of an Appalachian.
Of course, they all were.
Yeah, detested. Faced and retired all 9 innings of the batters that he faced. So 27 batters up, right. 27 batters down. But it wasn't a perfect game. So how did he do it?
Whoa.
Yeah. Okay. So 9 innings, 3 players, three opposing batters each, faced them, retired them in a row, but he didn't pitch a perfect game.
This is a great riddle. I mean, it couldn't have been a strikeout that the catcher. So nobody ever got on first base.
I didn't say that.
Okay. Well, that must be it. A wild pitch on a third strike?
He walked one batter.
Oh.
Who attempted to steal.
Got it, of course.
And he picked him off. Yeah. And so 9 batters.
That's a good one.
27 batters up, 27 batters down.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there were, to get back to your original question, there were a lot of really great Native American athletes in that era. And sports is such a window into culture. And when the race lines were going up, the Jim Crow rules were being enforced. There's so much activity and so much race blurring that's going on during that period of time.
Yes.
And it wasn't really about race. It was really more about color, in my opinion. If you were, like the Cuban Giants, who were not Cubans, they were African Americans.
Yes.
But if they were light enough skinned, they, there were some that were able to sneak into the major leagues and play.
That's absolutely right.
There was a Negro League player by the name of Grant who was a second baseman for, I want to say, the New York Giants. And Comiskey wrote a letter and said, I know who that second baseman is. That's Charlie Grant. And, I know that he plays in the Negro Leagues. And if you put that, I'm not going to use the word, on second base, then I'm going to find myself a Chinaman and put him at third, So it was really weird. And Asian Americans couldn't play in Major League Baseball. And this is about the time that Thorpe was playing baseball.
That's right. But of course, there were Indians playing at a time when African Americans couldn't.
Right.
And it's one of the sort of parts of American history that fascinates me is the difference between how the dominant white culture treated blacks and Indians in terms of they both were subjected to genocide and incredible racism in various ways. And yet it seemed to me that the American Indian was sort of, as I say in the book, romanticized and diminished at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's what I mean about race. It wasn't so much about race as it was about color. Native Americans were lighter skinned. Asians looked different. And so, boom, they're out. African Americans, too much difference, too much skin color difference, they're out. Latinos, if you're light enough, then you can play. If you're dark enough, then you can't. If you fast forward, and there's a story about 2 Cherokee brothers during World War II who were drafted. One, they were twins, not identical. One had darker features, the other had lighter features. One went into the 92nd, the 92nd unit, which was a segregated group. Why am I blanking on the word? And the other went into an integrated unit. So this country has always really struggled with race and color and ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Well, we still are.
Yeah, we still are. Very much so. When Thorpe was given his gold medals before they were taken away, he was praised as sort of the model American citizen at a time when he wasn't even a citizen, right?
That's really ironic.
But I'm fascinated by your nuanced perspective on the whole connection between U.S. citizenship and Native Americans.
Yeah, that was one of those issues that really tore a lot of Native communities apart. Because on the one hand, you had people like Carlos Montezuma and Teresa Bender and some of the Native American intellectuals of the time pressing for citizenship, saying, we're just as smart and as productive and as contributing citizens as white people, so we should be citizens too. On the other hand, you had communities like the Mohawk who were saying, look we're a sovereign nation and we want to be treated as such, and don't go conferring citizenship on us without talking to us first. And interestingly enough, again in World War II, in World War I, Native Americans couldn't be conscripted because they weren't citizens. World War II, they were. And I thought it was really interesting that the Mohawk had, they were really unhappy and sued the U.S. government, saying you don't have a right to, to force our men into registering for the draft because we're a sovereign nation. But at the same time, their leaders were independently declaring war on the Axis powers and encouraging their young men to enlist. So, this is really developing at this time. The progressive era, which was anything but progressive with Americans, is such a fascinating time because the country is being built with Indian resources. The lumber that is building the cities of America and the railroads is coming out of forests from reservations like mine. The metal, the minerals that are being used to, build skyscrapers and they're being mined out of areas from Indian reservations. So the wealth of the United States is coming at the expense of Native people who are becoming impoverished, who are losing their land, whose lives are totally regulated in every aspect, and so this world of sport is the one area where Native people are able to express themselves, where they're able to compete, where they're able to show off their talents. And this is certainly the case, of involving Jim Thorpe, who is,
absolutely,
arguably the world's greatest athlete, and humble. I really appreciated learning more about him. There's so many great moments in your book. Really. I wanted to ask you about his relationship with Pop Warner, because I found that just really fascinating. I saw that movie, and Pop Warner is really portrayed as, as this magnanimous savior of
exactly.
biggest booster, and he's my boy, and I learned so much.
I think he's the villain of my book in many ways.
Absolutely.
I mean, there were worse people in terms of race than Pop. But, yes, he presented himself as Thorpe's savior. But when at the most crucial time of Jim's life, he abandoned him, basically, and lied about it.
To save his own skin.
And then the movie portrays him as the savior, so.
Yeah. Well, as you pointed out, I didn't know he consulted on the movie.
Yes, he did.
So good on you for pointing that out. And Avery Brundage, too.
Bundridge. Brundage.
Brundage. Boy, I have a hard time. Brundage. Avery
Yes.
Brundage. I have a hard time with that name. Always have.
Yeah, well, I just recorded the audio version of my book, so I was stumbling over it too.
But I didn't know about his Nazi connections.
Horrible. Yeah.
And do you think?
1936.
You don't come out and say that it was jealousy that drove him, but do you think that his performance at those same Olympics that Thorpe shone, do you think that was what?
Yeah, that's sort of, I understate that because I don't really know, but I certainly think it. Absolutely do. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, there was such callousness.
Oh, I know.
It's just really tragic. But boy, Thorpe hustled to the end, didn't he?
Yes.
He never really gave up.
No, I know. I was alternately feeling sorry for him and admiring him, because he just kept going all the way. So along with the issue of citizenship, I'm also fascinated as an outsider on the whole issue of blood quantum, which seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that's sort of imposed on Native society by the dominant white society.
Yeah, that goes back to the treaty making era, where the government negotiated these treaties and land coerced land from Native people in exchange for dry goods and a blacksmith shop and a school and all these things that may or may not have come, and money. And they called that annuities, and so the tribe would receive an annuity amount for a set period of time, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. And the way the government, by this time, there'd been a lot of intermarriage, and so blood quantum of Native people was diminishing. And so the out that the government used was to say, well, once somebody gets below 25%, why then they're not an Indian anymore. They're assimilated and they're just white. And so that 25% blood quantum was imposed on Native communities initially. And during this period, during the Progressive Era, where Native governments were not functioning, you couldn't have a government, you couldn't practice your religion, you couldn't wear Native clothes, you couldn't speak your language. Yep. It was just so repressive. In 1934, the government realized, John Collier, who was FDR's Bureau of Indian Affairs Secretary or Commissioner of Indian Affairs, had worked with immigrant communities in tenements in New York and found that immigrants who were doing, relatively well were doing so because they had a strong sense of culture and community. So Collier kind of convinced the powers that be in Washington that by helping Native communities revitalize, reclaim culture, and at the same time stopping this whole allotment process, which was privatizing Indian land and opening up land to white homesteaders, that Native communities would stabilize and begin to prosper. It didn't really happen, but anyway, that was the idea. Right. So when the Indian Reorganization Act was approved in 1934, Native communities were encouraged to reconstitute their governments. So these IRA governments emerged, but they were really foisted on Native people in a white image. So they were set up like mayor, town council, with a chair, which a chairman then, now just a chairperson, which is more what you think of when you think of organizations like the Red Cross or a service club have chairmen. These governments didn't have presidents or so these constitutions were set up and they were set up in a a white model, and sometimes it created these weird power dynamics. But they adopted this 25% blood quantum. And so, I'm sorry, it took a long time to get there, didn't it? So
it was worth it.
Right. Well, so in 1934, Indian Reorganization Act, Native communities are allowed to reconstitute their governments, but this 25% blood quantum is a holdover from the federal government, and it's written into most of these IRA constitutions. And it's only been over the years that Native communities have kind of looked into the future and realized, hey, we're blood quantuming ourselves right out of existence here. And right now we have these communities that are struggling with, they're small, and and their young people are marrying outside their tribe because they're related to everybody in their tribe. And so they're realizing they have to do things differently. So some are going to lineal descendancy. Others are allowing blood quantum from related tribes to count, which just delays the inevitable problem of genocide, of self-genocide. So it's a problem that many communities are currently grappling with.
And of course, it's the complete cultural opposite of the way white America treats African Americans, right? Where if you have 1/16 of black blood, you're black.
You're black, right?
But they did the opposite, and mostly, wouldn't you say, for financial reasons, this was imposed on the tribes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it began with if you drop below 25%, then you don't get any of the annuity money.
Yeah.
We don't have to pay you.
Yeah. So, Patty, this has been wonderful. Can you close by telling us about the various things you've been traveling around the country? I know, going to Alaska and Montana and all over the place for your studies. Can you tell us about some of the things you're looking at and learning?
What I'm doing?
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to receive a National Science Foundation grant with my colleague Deborah Raxani, who works with giant screen films, and they create large format screen films for science museums around the country. And ours is part of a project to create a giant screen film, a PBS series, and four youth-produced short documentaries about climate change. So I'm working with the Quinault in Washington State. I hope to be working with the Salish Kootenai in Montana, working with the Porch Band of Creeks in outside Mobile, Alabama, and then Bad River, my own community, and helping to nurture young kids to look at how climate change is affecting their cultural and natural landscapes and what their communities are doing about it. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that by and large, Native American nations are really leaders in climate change mitigation and adaptation. The Quinault, for example, have lost, they've been losing their salmon because they lost their glacier in 2015. They have storms that are increasing in frequency and intensity. Their salmon rivers are running too fast, so that when the salmon lay their eggs, the eggs get washed out to sea rather than being able to, their spawning grounds are all messed up. So they are engineering these giant log jams and bolting root balls and Douglas fir together and dropping them in their river to slow it down. And the salmon are coming back. And they're really pushing the federal government to dismantle some of the dams that were created in the 30s and 40s to allow those salmon to come back and spawn in those once fabulously salmon-producing rivers.
Is that along the Columbia or what part of Washington State?
The Quinault are on the coast of the Olympic Peninsula.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
So they're on the Pacific side, and they're also dealing with rising sea levels, and their oral history tells them that every 350 years or so they get a huge earthquake and tsunami, like 100-foot tsunami. And a lot of their critical buildings housing children and elder programs are located in the tsunami zone. Oh. So they're trying to move to higher ground. So there's some really interesting stories there, and I'm working with 2 young women who are freshmen in high school, and they want to interview their grandma about fishing and tribal people about natural resource enhancement, and some of their cultural leaders about why salmon is so culturally significant to their people. I just can't believe I have a job like this.
That's great.
So cool.
I think one time I was trying to reach you. You were in Alaska, right?
Yeah, I went to the Arctic Encounters Symposium. We have some some of our scientific collaborators on this project, which is called Ice Worlds, located in Alaska. So, boy, did I learn a lot at that conference. It's really interesting. The circumpolar region, 70% of the landmass is Russian. And so when the Russians are being shunned right now, and critical issues like climate change and, fishing in Arctic waters, those issues don't go away. But there was a lot of anxiety, especially among the Scandinavian countries. And now Norway and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. So there were a lot of really fascinating issues that were discussed there.
At the end of June, I'm going to the Department of Interior to give a copy of the book to Deb Holland.
Lucky you.
And I'm struck by her so strongly. What do you think she means to the whole Indian community?
Oh, everybody is so proud of her, and she has such a genuine heart. You talk to anybody that knows her, and they talk about how sincere and honest and authentic she is. And, when she and Sharice Davids first got into Congress, the first thing they did, one of the first bills they crafted was the 2 bills to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yes.
And that brought a lot of awareness. That was something that those of us in Indian country knew about, but that kind of awareness was something that needed to be brought to a mainstream audience. And now her work with Indian boarding schools, she's just, I think she's doing a really bang-up job there.
Yeah.
It's nice to have somebody who knows Indians being in charge.
That's for sure. Yeah. Well, Patty, this has been great fun, and thank you so much for everything you're doing and for encouraging me.
Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, is available online and at bookstores on August 9th. Visit davidmarinus.com to order your copy. This has been an episode of the David Marinus Ink in Our Blood podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll subscribe to the Ink in Our Blood podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or whichever podcast service you prefer. If you loved it, we'd love it if you left a rating and review. Ink in Our Blood is produced by Metamorphosis.agency. Music has been written and provided by Monica Ryan. Ink in Our Blood is hosted by Sarah Marinus Vanderschaff. Thank you for listening.